Welcome to the series Understanding Human Evil. My name is Michael Hardiman. I work as a psychologist and an educator in the west of Ireland. And I've put together this series on the subject of human evil because I think most people would recognize now we're living in dark times. And Carl Jung famously said that we would have to be positively blind not to see the colossal role that evil plays in our world. So it's an extremely important topic, and over the next series of presentations, I want to tease it out, unpack it a bit, so that you will be able to maybe develop a more informed understanding of the problem of evil as it operates in our world. So, in this first session, I'm just going to introduce the topic and talk a little bit about what the other content will be in the rest of the series. My hope is to put together about 20 minutes for each presentation, because I think 20 minutes gives you enough information to be able to take away and to reflect on it and integrate it into your own thinking and other ideas you may already have. Because, as Hannah Arendt, who was one of the greatest experts on the problem of evil from the 20th century, would say thinking is an incredibly important part of understanding and preventing human evil. So we all have to become thinkers in some way, shape, or form, and the challenge to become a thinker goes right back to the Socratic statement in the trial in Athens, where he says the unexamined life is not worth living. So, because I work as a philosopher, psychologist, and educator, I have great store by the human faculty of thinking and reflecting about ourselves and the world we live in. Sometimes people talk about education as being teaching people what to think rather than how to think, that modern education is focused a lot on that. I don't think that distinction is actually very useful, because if we think about what we think about versus how to think, well, how to think and developing the skill of how to think always presupposes that you're going to be thinking about something. So there has to be content. So the content is just as important as the process of thinking about it. If you're making a cake, you need the ingredients to, put them all together and mix them up and do that. So similarly with our thinking, as a dynamic process, a cognitive capacity that we have as a human being, we need to apply it to something. And if we don't have the content, then we really can't come up with very much of value as a product of our thinking. So in this process of the next series on the subject of evil, I want to present you with a lot of content. Most of this content is going to come from the fields of psychology and philosophy, some of it from sociology and some of it from history. But I'm going to bring these strands together in a way that I hope is digestible and not overly abstract. The big difficulty with something like a concept like evil, and also in the world of philosophy and psychology sometimes, is we tend to abstract it. In other words, it tends to lose its connection to the human experience, what in the modern world is called, or in the postmodern world is called, our lived experience. So we need to make sure that this doesn't become a dry, abstract sort of conversation. Because if we're to try and find a way to understand evil, it needs to be done in a context in which we actually have some emotional connection to the content in which we're looking at. James Dawes, who interviewed the old and aged Japanese soldiers who were imprisoned for many, many years and decades after the rape of Nanjing. He interviewed them and spoke with them and wrote an excellent book on the problem of evil called Evil Men. And he says about the term evil, using the term evil, he says, "Our moral language is impoverished if it cannot account for those acts that shock our conscience, acts whose enormity cannot be encompassed by the wrong, bad, or even wicked. We need to conceptually distinguish such acts both as a matter of respect for the truth value in our emotions and as a matter of respect for the survivors and the dead." So he is calling for us to hold on to the term evil. Now, why am I saying that? Because in the academy, there's a school of thought that says we should not use this word evil because it doesn't help us. It has no conceptual weight. It doesn't help us to do anything. One scholar, Matthews, he says, look, he said, evil seems to be for us solely a term of distantiated extrinsic judgment and not a useful tool for informing and guiding our lives. And then he goes on, he says, it seems a non-operational part of our moral language, lacking fruitful purpose. It is merely a conceptual artifact, a ghostly vestigial presence from a previous moral language. Now, there's a lot in that. This argument comes from the idea that evil belongs in the past. It's a vestigial organ of, we'll say, the Judeo-Christian understanding of the world, and that it has such strong ties to the issue of religious thinking that it no longer really is relevant to our world today. Personally, I disagree strongly with that view. And you will see throughout the next series that we will be approaching evil in a very strong practical sense, that it exists as an entity, as a human entity, and that it makes sense for us to see it as such. My job in this next series is to unpack the different meanings of it. So one thing I would say now immediately is that I am narrowing the focus here somewhat, because evil is a very broad concept. So the title of this presentation is Understanding Human Evil. So human evil can be considered to be the evil that's involved in human beings. This separates us from natural evil, because natural evil is the evil that is encountered by nature, the mercilessness of nature, the cruelty of nature, the tsunami that drowns 200,000 people, the famine that kills 500,000 innocents. And equally, it leaves out the demonic, the argument of the demonic and spiritual forces of evil, which are a major part of Christian theology and Christian thinking. And we will examine some element of that only insofar as it makes sense of how human beings interpret evil doing. So this first session really then is focused on the reality of evil. It's a real thing, and it's here. So if we narrow it to human evil, then we ask the question, well, what does it actually mean? So this gets us to get to a place where we need to make some kind of a decision about a definition. How do we define it? In philosophy, there's tendency to be two worldviews of this. One is called the ontological, and the other is called the consequential. This is the language that's used among philosophers of and moral philosophy. Consequentialism is the idea that we tend to define something in terms of its consequences, and I will be looking at this problem of evil from that point of view. The people who argue against the use of the concept of evil as useful tend to be arguing it because they don't want to see it as this abstract thing, and so they would be arguing against a deontological view of evil. Consequentialist view of evil tends to define evil in terms of its consequences. And so I'm going to take a definition. I'm going to bring it from two sources. One is a philosopher called John Keeks, and the other is a psychologist, Philip Zimbardo. The definition I'm going to work with is that human evil, is intentionally causing grave harm and suffering undeservedly to a human being. So that keeps us within the human element. And you'll see undeserved means that, because you could say you could cause great harm to somebody when you put them in prison. But the question is now, if they were innocent and put in prison, that's an evil. But if they were guilty of a great crime and you take away their freedom for 20 years, you've done a great amount of harm to that person, but you're doing it for justifiable reasons. They deserve it, in other words. So undeserved harm, so grave, undeserved harm to another human being. And that harm may not just be physical, it could be psychological. So we will see, for example, in a situation where a person in a relationship with somebody who suffers from pathological narcissism is ground down until they're a shell of a human being. And we've seen in abusive relationships that's often the outcome. So it's a very broad definition on one hand. It doesn't cover everything, but it covers, in my mind, this definition would cover almost 80-90% of the evil that we see in the world. The next question that's the first part, is the undeserved harm, intentionally causing undeserved harm. And the piece from Zimbardo, Philip Zimbardo, who is famous for his Stanford prison experiment. You may be aware of that. You'll come across this in a later presentation again in the 60s, where I think it was early 70s, sorry, where he got a group of students at Stanford University, and he put them into two groups, prisoners and prison wardens, and they acted out this thing called a prison experiment. They created a prison environment in the basement of Stanford University. And he had to finish the experiment after a few days because it went so crazily bad. The prison warders, who were students who had no axe to grind and no particular predilection for hurting other people, became cruel and corrupt. The students who were the prisoners became victims and began to act passively and in a helpless, hopeless kind of a manner. And so he developed his a theory of evil around that, and around how easily we are corrupted by our social environment. But he talks about evil not just in terms of the individual, but our power, our influence on other people to create evil. So now we can come to a definition where we can say that human evil is intentionally causing grave, undeserved harm and suffering to another human being, or using our power to get somebody else to do so on our behalf. That's our definition. That's our working definition. Now, immediately this begs the question, well, if we're looking at doing it on our behalf, that opens up a different avenue. In the first part of the definition, it's the evil of the individual, my individual evil. And in the second piece, it's my capacity to influence somebody else to do it for me. So now we are opening up individual evil and collective evil. So our first duality here will be the difference between these two pieces. The moral challenge to the individual is opened when we think about how I behave in a way that causes grave harm and suffering to another. Or do I help somebody else to do it? Do I collude? And now we will see, and as we go through this series, we will discuss a lot of the philosophers that have made important contributions and observations around it. And I will introduce you to them, and then you can follow them up. So Hannah Arendt would be one of the most important ones in terms of her influence on my thinking around evil. And her major contribution is in understanding and developing the concept of what's called the banality of evil. The idea that, and she says this, most evil is actually caused by people who never decided whether to be good or bad themselves. So this is the evil that is produced in a collective form, in the cruelty and in the persecution and in the suffering caused to other people by a group, by the mob, by the party, by the tribe, by whatever, and our role in that. So now as we think about this, we can come to some conclusions. We can say, okay, when we think about evil, we think about it in terms of what it means consequentially. We think about our own particular piece, the little part we do. What do we do in our lives that contributes to evil doing? Our own personal evil, which Jung calls the shadow. And we will, in our next session, because we will be looking at certain theories of evil, the part that the individual plays, you as an individual will, your dark side. How are you dealing with that? Do you understand it? Have you reflected on it? And secondly, are you a part of something that is an evil-doing entity? That's enough for today on this one in terms of the definition we're working for. The second thing that I want to talk is I want to introduce the rest of the series. So we're looking at the reality of evil, the individual versus the collective, the personal individual has to deal with it in terms of the three aspects that we have, the faculties that we have as individuals to deal with it, being our reasoning, which is our thinking. We'll go back to Hannah Arendt's thing about thinking, the importance of thinking in its role in evil doing, or non-thinking as again. The will, which is the issue of agency, because we did talk earlier about intentionality, and intentionality, needs to be part of our definition, because if it's unintended, that we don't have the moral responsibility. So if I go out and I drive and I drive too quickly, and I am not intending to harm anybody, but I am being careless. So if I knock over a cyclist, I see a cyclist up ahead, and I'm just maybe try to use my phone or something and knock over cyclists and kill them, I have caused this terrible thing. I've caused terrible harm if the person is paralyzed. There's a major moral difference between doing that on one hand, or secondly, knowing that that cyclist is actually my hated neighbour who objected to my planning permission, and that I've been boiling with resentment and anger, and in a moment of rage I decide, no, I'm not going to let him go, and I drive over him. Now, that's the intentionality is very important there. So, intentionality includes the concept of will, agency, free will. So this, of course, is a huge philosophical issue. How much do we have? How much free will do we actually have? Can we be held morally responsible for something if we don't have free will? So at the individual level, intentionally causing undeserved grave suffering and harm, which is evil doing, we have to recognize it, which is our capacity for reasoning. We have to have will, which is agency. And then a third faculty, which is conscience, which is that there's a relationship between these, that we have a faculty called conscience, which comes from the Latin consciento, which is to know wit. We know it ourselves, that internal, in order to actually know the decisions we make about what we do morally. Okay, so that's that piece. Now, in the next session, I'm going to look at the philosophical approaches to evil. There's two main strands of thinking about human evil, called the dualist and the privative understandings. And these originate in Christianity and in Judeo-Christian thinking in the West. And most of the focus in my work here will be on Western philosophy and Western thinking, because that's what I know best, I guess. And we're in the West as we speak. The third session we're going to try and look at something called radical evil. And in that session, I'm going to introduce you to one of the great moral philosophers, that of Immanuel Kant, and how Hannah Arendt utilizes his thinking in relation to what is called radical evil. The fourth session, and this will be fourth and fifth session, we'll look at Hannah Arendt's notion of the banality of evil. And this is the notion of the thoughtless evildoing, the desk murders of the Holocaust, and what are the implications of what she found in terms of what's happening in our world today. The next two sessions after that are going to be focused on ideological evil, and this is the evil that people do when they believe that they're doing right, and how ideology can corrupt our minds. I've written fairly extensively on this. Again, one of the most, I would say, prevalent understandings of human evil in terms of the amount of evil that is produced by it is ideology, and corrupt ideology. And there's a connection between these two, between the banality of evil and pernicious ideology. And because the pernicious ideology provides the justification and often the political or religious framework by which banal evildoers operate. So these are two, and I would say most evil in the world is created by that mix. And finally, the last sessions are going to deal with narcissistic and psychopathic evil. And I would say in today's world, we are looking at certain situations where narcissism is a very serious problem. And narcissism was a very badly understood and undeveloped concept until about 25 years ago. And because of that, a lot of our interpretation of the past and our interpretation of history lacked the frame of narcissism to understand the leadership, that the certain types of leaders who actually created enormous levels of evil. So narcissistic and psychopathic evil is a form of evil doing and suffering produced by people simply because they are actually narcissists. So that's the story, and I'm looking forward to talking to you in our next session, which we will call the philosophical approaches to evil. So I hope that will be helpful and you will have some time to think a little bit about that and think about that question, individual, your own shadow. What's that bit? That's sometimes easier to come to terms with, in terms of that you're thinking, right, okay, you're a decent human being, you're not wishing harm on anybody, and you're not doing anything that you think is evil. Doesn't mean you don't have a shadow. Or the second, are you engaged collectively? Are you adding some power to evil doing that you haven't really considered? And again, evil doing, because you're able to define it now and say, well, is there something about causing grave harm and suffering undeserved to others? The role of thinking, your reasoning, your conscience, your will. Do you feel empowered? What about your own agency? And then there's evil by omission, which is preventing yourself from doing something about it. We will talk a little bit about that later on when we talk about morality and moral responsibility. Okay, I'll see you in section 2. Bye.